The 14th of March, 25. Preachers diminish, actually they delete, the efficacy of natural revelation and the natural responses of non-Israelites, Gentiles, while they elevate the religious responses and representations of Israel, albeit in refashioned symbols. Hence they read Acts 17 and Athens imagining an especially idolatrous society, as if Israelite religion were by virtue of its particular religious observances better than one of the nations with the same idolatrous mind. Obviously, the temples and idols made with men's hands, as in Israel, would be destroyed, as in Israel, being shadows that depend on real light, as in Israel. That light, which lightens every man that comes into the world, is the Alpha and Omega of the Father of all of us pagans, nations. Israel's election was not God's response to any special qualities in Israel except perhaps the potential to demonstrate His grace and sovereignty as the fundamental universal, all flesh included, character of that in which we all live and move and have our being. That we are largely Judaized as Christians does not mean that the shadows of the Old Covenant ought to be preached as the foundations of the salvation of the respective nations. The treatment of Israel was respective, pertinent to Israel, and the so-called omissions and implied deficiencies of Paul's sermon are in no way deficiencies. Israel, being chosen out of the nations, was, necessarily, just another one of the nations. It was not exceptional but made to serve an exceptional purpose even through its pagan-like beliefs and behaviors. We Judaized Christians, by our fleshly attachment to the destroyed T1, T2, and hoped-for T3 temples and rejigged religious observances of Jerusalem are rendered unsure about the fatherhood of God over all the nations. Thus, when it comes to preaching on Paul's sermon to the Athenian court on Mars Hill, Christian preachers stumble over what they imply to be Paul's deficiencies in his sermon. The preachers uniformly expect Paul to take the Athenians up the Romans road, a kind of, for spiritual laws, subjective Moses-based guilt trip to the Jewish judge. The following is a response to another Christian sermon on Acts 17. I take only one of the nuances from the sermon to illustrate the difference between the implied Moses-based judge of the universe and the Christian perception of our advocate judge. The statement requires expansion, but this note, via iPhone, will be reference enough to launch us on the required trajectory. Response to sermon on Acts 17. Preachers diminish, actually they delete, the efficacy of natural revelation and the natural responses of non-Israelites, Gentiles, while they elevate the religious responses and representations of Israel. Hence they read Acts 17 and Athens imagining them to be an especially idolatrous society, as if Israelite religion were by virtue of its particular religious observances better than one of the nations with the same idolatrous mind. Obviously, the temples and idols made with men's hands, as in Israel, would be destroyed, as in Israel, being shadows that depend on real light, as in Israel. That light, which lightens every man that comes into the world, is the Alpha and Omega of the Father all of us pagans, nations, Israel included. Israel's election was not God's response to any special qualities in Israel except perhaps the potential to demonstrate His grace and sovereignty as the fundamental universal, all flesh included, character of that in which we all live and move and have our being. Incomplete. Co-pilot response to the notes above. Your analysis highlights the complexities and nuances in interpreting and preaching Acts 17. The perceived elevation of Israelite religious practices and the subsequent emphasis on natural revelation in other cultures can create a sense of imbalance in sermons. Here are some key points you've raised. 1. Equating idolatry. Both Israelite and Gentile societies had their own forms of idolatry, but the sermon seems to elevate Israel's religious practices above others, potentially diminishing the universality of God's revelation. 2. Light for all. The light which lightens every man is a universal concept, not exclusive to Israel. Israel's election serves to demonstrate God's grace and sovereignty universally. 3. Old Covenant shadows. The Old Covenant, specific to Israel, shouldn't be the foundation for the salvation of all nations. Israel was chosen for a purpose, not because of inherent superiority. For Judaized Christians, attachment to the symbols of the destroyed and hoped-for temples may hinder a fuller understanding of God's fatherhood over all nations. 5. Preaching Paul's sermon. Preachers might stumble by expecting Paul to adhere to a specific theological framework, missing the cultural context and the broader message of God's grace. 6. Cultural respect. Paul respected the cultural context of his audience, emphasizing God's grace as pertinent to each situation. The expectation for him to follow a "for spiritual laws" approach can overlook this respect. Your insights call for a more balanced approach to interpreting and preaching Acts 17, one that respects the unique cultural contexts and emphasizes the universality of God's revelation and grace. If you want, we can delve deeper into any of these points or explore other aspects of this topic. What are your thoughts? JDC. You are right in noting my concern about understanding and respecting cultural contexts. But this is more than common courtesy. Its great significance is not merely a kind of cross-cultural condescension, and it is not merely a device by which the missionary can avoid unnecessary offense and subtly catch the ear and affections of the audience. This is not an approach or a rhetorical technique. Meeting and speaking grace within, and utterly sensitive to a foreign culture, is the whole business of incarnation. When Paul is speaking to the Athenians, he is not being clever by using their poets. The Christian preacher says they did not have the prophets. Paul is not disappointed, rather, he deals with the nations according to the light that was theirs by virtue of the universal providence and wisdom of God. In other words, Paul's sermon displays the gospel of the sovereignty of God's grace in his Son as it pertains, outside of Israel and beyond Judaism, to the Athenians. That blood and Jewish particulars regarding temple theology are absent from the sermon is simply a proper reflection of the fact that these Athenians are not Jews, not in bondage to the same religion as the Jews, and not logically, forensically or existentially in bondage to the same narratives as the Jews. The universal reach of the love of the Father of us all is in no way diminished except for the particular perceptions of unbelief that we each approach our living, being, moving, thinking and doing. The particular forms of the complications of the Jews do not belong to the nations, but the boundaryless love of our common Father is common to each of us, albeit as demonstrated but in a particular cult. That particularism belongs to each of us. That exceptionalism claimed by Israel and the USA is repeated infinitely throughout the world, and it is exceptionally uniquely applied in every case, though this is often not implied in Christian sermons. Co-pilot. You've articulated a profound point about the importance of genuinely understanding and engaging with different cultural contexts. This goes beyond mere courtesy or a strategic approach. It's about genuinely embodying and conveying grace in a way that resonates deeply within each unique culture. Paul's use of Athenian poets wasn't a clever tactic but a recognition of the light already present in their culture through God's universal providence. Here's a further breakdown of your insights. 1. Incarnational ministry. Truly engaging with a foreign culture is the essence of incarnation. It's about meeting people where they are, within their cultural and existential contexts, and speaking to the light already present in their lives through God's providence. JDC, it's more than approach, it is how God is, it is Him, it is the ocean in which we be. 2. Paul's sermon in Athens. Paul's sermon at the Areopagus wasn't about being disappointed in the Athenians' lack of prophets but about acknowledging and respecting the light they already had. This approach underscores the universality of God's grace, transcending cultural and religious boundaries. 3. Absence of Jewish particulars. The absence of Jewish temple theology in Paul's sermon is appropriate, as the Athenians weren't Jews. They weren't bound by the same religious narratives, and Paul's message reflected this reality, focusing instead on the universal love of the Father. 4. Universal reach of God's love. The love of the Father of us all transcends specific religious complications. While particularisms exist within different cultures, God's boundaryless love is universal, applicable to everyone. 5. Cultural exceptionalism. The notion of exceptionalism isn't unique to Israel or the USA, it's a common human tendency. However, the exceptional nature of God's love and grace is uniquely applied to each context, though this is often overlooked in Christian sermons. By understanding and respecting cultural contexts deeply, we can better embody and communicate the Gospel's universal message of grace and love. This approach honors the diversity of God's creation and His providence in each unique cultural setting. Would you like to explore this topic further or delve into another aspect of your analysis? JDC. The Gospel is not limited in form and dogmas to blood sacrifices or to cultural practices of any kind. The good news is that in common living, moving and being, God's grace rules and the outcome for all reflects that. Notions of limited atonement and election should not discourage any individual's faith in the love of God for them. Such parameters indicate particular purposes within particular theological frames of reference. Jesus' ministry was to His own people in that context, according to that particular form of collective bondage. Its limitation was necessary and completely fulfilling for them. Other responses to the universal sense of the divine must be just as uniquely elected and reconciled according to the particulars of their bondage. Co-pilot. You've captured the essence of the Gospel's universal and inclusive message beautifully. Indeed, the Gospel transcends cultural practices, blood sacrifices, and specific theological frames. It's a profound testament to God's grace that manifests in our everyday living, moving, and being. Here are a few points that echo your thoughts. 1. Universal grace. God's grace isn't confined to specific forms or dogmas. It's present in the mundane aspects of our lives, offering hope and redemption to all. 2. Inclusive love. Notions like limited atonement and election reflect particular theological perspectives but should not diminish anyone's faith in God's love. Everyone can find their place in the divine narrative. 3. Contextual ministry. Jesus' ministry to His own people was necessary and fulfilling within that specific context. Similarly, the universal sense of the divine finds unique expressions in different cultures and contexts. 4. Unique responses. Each culture and community has its own way of responding to the divine. These responses are valid and meaningful, reflecting the particularities of their experience and bondage. 5. Incarnation in diversity. The Gospel's message of incarnation isn't about uniformity but about recognizing and honoring the diversity of human experiences and expressions of faith. Your reflections emphasize the need for a broader, more inclusive understanding of the Gospel that respects and celebrates the unique ways in which different cultures experience and express God's love. This approach not only enriches our faith but also fosters a deeper connection with the universal message of grace and redemption. Is there a specific aspect you'd like to delve deeper into, or any other insights you'd like to share? JDC. Yes. I'd like to show how Paul's sermon includes many of the profound assumptions and outcomes that are precious to Judaized Christians but without the burdens of doctrines which pertain to Jews. By the way, the perspective of these notes does not imply that the election and exclusiveness of Israel is not a fact but that it was purposeful and that it remains culturally valid and a vital place for its constituents to express the love of God and love for God. In fact, exclusiveness and exclusion are functional aspects of universal grace. As Paul says, God has set these boundaries for the purpose of universal love and grace. We identify differently so that we may be bound by love, not without the need of consciousness of the other. In this we know the actual life of God among us. As Judaism-conscious Christians we refer to the adoption as sons who spontaneously cry, Abba, Father. In Paul's sermon, the uncomplicated assumption is rightly stated as, we are all his offspring. This statement of Paul's is not a lesser sonship or fatherhood. It directly reflects the nature of being, as it is not as unbelief projects it. Jewish unbelief is reflected not only in the narratives of the fall but also in Israel's remedy. That particular remedy reflects that particular bondage of the consciousness and therefore that particular consciousness. Paul cuts through all those cultural specific perceptions and right and simply says, we are all God's offspring. I hope to deal with the other points of Paul's sermon in like manner quite soon. Co-pilot. You've highlighted a critical aspect of Paul's sermon, its ability to resonate deeply with Judaized Christians while simultaneously shedding the specific burdens of doctrines pertaining to Jews. Here's a breakdown of your key points and some further reflections. 1. Purposeful exclusiveness. The election and exclusiveness of Israel are not denied but understood as purposeful and culturally valid. They serve a vital role in expressing the love of God, JDC, to that nation. This exclusiveness, in turn, becomes a functional aspect of universal grace. 2. Boundaries for universal love. The boundaries set by God serve the purpose of universal love and grace. Different identities and consciousnesses highlight the need for understanding and loving the other, enriching the actual life of God among us. 3. Adoption as sons. For Judaism-conscious Christians, the adoption as sons who cry Abba, Father reflects a deep, intimate relationship with God that transcends cultural specificities. 4. Universal offspring. Paul's statement, "We are all his offspring," is a profound declaration of universal sonship and fatherhood. It's not a lesser form of relationship but a direct reflection of the nature of being, free from the projections of unbelief. 5. Cutting through cultural specifics. Paul effectively cuts through the cultural specific perceptions and narratives, stating simply and directly that we are all God's offspring. This universal message resonates across different cultures and contexts. 6. Universal grace and love. The Gospel's universal grace and love are not limited to particular forms or cultural practices. They transcend these boundaries, offering hope and redemption to all. Your reflections on Paul's sermon emphasize the importance of understanding and respecting different cultural contexts while conveying the universal message of God's grace and love. This approach not only honors the diversity of human experiences but also enriches our faith and connection with the divine. JDC, furthermore, it reflects the factual ontology of being, of things as they are. This is not a projection but the nature of the universe. Would you like to delve into more specific points of Paul's sermon, or explore how these insights can be applied in contemporary preaching and ministry? Soon. Thank you.